Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar. It's now almost 20 years since the national minimum wage was introduced. That was way back in 1998. So although last year we had an additional level added, i.e. the national living wage, and although that created quite a lot of confusion, basically because of what it's called, it was still really just an additional level of icing on the cake, an additional tier within the minimum wage structure, and the rules all stayed the same. So you would have thought that any teething problems with those rules would have been ironed out long ago. However, even the largest employers still face claims for what is often inadvertent underpayment. As usual with our webinars, we'll look at the background and give you some information about the law, but we also aim to provide some practical tips and action points to help protect your business and to keep you compliant. But before we start jumping into the detail, and for those of you who may not have attended any of our previous webinars, we'd just like to introduce ourselves. My name is Alison Blackhurst. I'm the HR Knowledge Manager at HR Solutions, and I will be leading the session today. And I'm joined by my colleague, Sue Watson, our HR Operations Manager. Good afternoon, Sue.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm here just to field any questions or queries or technical problems that you might have. Please use your question and chat panel to the side of your screen. If you would like a copy of the PowerPoint presentation after the webinar, then please do send us a message and we will send them over to you. If you have any questions specific to the topic, then by all means contact us and we will try and respond to you directly after the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, so let's launch in then. It is a little bit of a dry topic. I will do the very best I can to keep this as interesting, as lively as possible, but clearly it is a topic that many of you are interested in because we've had a very good take-up for this webinar. So, do we all understand the minimum wage rules in full? Well, it would seem not. Either that or else a lot of employers are deliberately flouting the law. Now, if you fail to pay the minimum wage and you are caught and prosecuted, then one of the things that can happen to you is you can be named and shamed. And in the most recent round of naming and shaming, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, who does this, revealed the names of 233 employers who had failed to pay more than 13,000 workers the minimum wage or the national living wage. And the arrears that they were looking at in this round of naming and shaming, that's not a full year, by the way, but they were looking at arrears just short of 2 million and fines, additionally fines of quite close to that at 1.9 million. Now, a lot of that was accounted for by Argos, which is a high-profile employer, and Argos apparently failed to pay almost £1.5 million to just over 12,000 of its workers. So there are some high-profile names involved here, but it's all sizes and all sectors which can be named and shamed. And HMRC is currently investigating around 2,000 cases of underpaid wages. Now, hot on the heels of the latest naming and shaming, there was also a ruling last month by the Nottingham Employment Tribunal, and that was against an employer called the Best Connection Group. Now, you might not have heard of them, but they're an employment agency that supplies workers. But you will certainly have heard of the employer that they supply these agency staff to, because it was Sports Direct, who have come in for, needless to say, even more negative criticism as a result of this. Now, there were very large sums involved here. The Best Connection Group was fined £263,000 in multiple penalties, and it was ordered to pay almost £470,000 to the underpaid workers. So given that, we thought this was a good time to take a look at some of the more common pitfalls that are tripping up the unwary employers. Now, just before we go into the nitty-gritty of all of those, as most of you are all probably aware, there are 5 rates, as indicated on the slide: the national living wage, adult rate, development rate, the rate for those aged 16 to 17, and the apprentice rate. And the apprentice rate only applies to those who are under age 19, or if they're age 19 or above, they must be in their first 12 months of an apprenticeship. And what happens with the minimum wage is the Low Pay Commission consults generally, and then it suggests revised rates to the government. And if these are approved, they then take effect each April. And the government has said that it plans to increase the rate of the national living wage at least to 60% of median earnings by 2020, subject to sustained economic growth. Now, if that happens, the Office for Budget Responsibility now forecasts that that will be £8.75 by 2020. And of course, 2020 is not that far off. An increase to £8.75 is a very big increase. What we are not sure of at the moment is whether the increase will only be applied to the living wage, in which case the gap will get wider, or whether all of the minimum wage rates will have a similar level of increase applied. So it is an area certainly to keep an eye on, to start budgeting for now, because we could be looking at some very significant increases in the national living wage, which of course applies to everybody over 25 or over. So it's a large proportion of the working population. Now, the Low Pay Commission also is the body that reports on non-compliance and enforcement of the minimum wage. And last month it published a new report which is looking at the scale and the nature of non-compliance. And it found that thousands of workers are underpaid each year. But it did say that the proportion of low-paid workers who are underpaid has actually fallen very slightly. And there have been some real successes in terms of minimum wage enforcement. The report found some quite interesting facts. First of all, it found that underpayment is highly seasonal, and my first reaction to that was to assume that it's either summer workers in agriculture or possibly Christmas workers, but actually it wasn't. Maybe unsurprisingly, non-compliance with the minimum wage is at its highest immediately following an increase in the rates of the minimum wage, when up to 20% of workers who are entitled to the national living wage could be underpaid. And that's estimated to be somewhere between 305,000 and 580 workers. And then the rate of underpayment falls in the period 3 to 6 months after an increase, and it goes down to about 13% of low-paid workers who may be underpaid. Still quite a large number, though. The LPC believes that the worst cases of underpayment are almost certainly hidden. So the number of people who are underpaid could be considerably higher than previously thought. But what was interesting to me certainly was that it's not just hourly paid workers that are underpaid. A large proportion of monthly paid salary workers are paid less than the minimum wage. Now, in terms of people who are earning the minimum wage, only 11% of workers who are paid at the national living wage are salaried. But these people make up 44% of those paid below it. So that is clearly an area where we go into underpayments. Women were more likely to be paid less than the minimum wage, and they were also least likely to complain about it. Now, there has been a huge focus on compliance and broader communications regarding the living wage, and this has resulted in a large increase in the number of underpaid workers and the amount of arrears being identified. And just to give you an idea of that, in 2016 to 17, we're looking at 10.9 million of arrears for 98,000 workers. Now, that's almost a threefold increase since 2014 to 15, when the figure was 3.3 million of arrears for 26,300 workers. So we are looking at certainly a lot more being identified in the sense of the amount of the payment and also the number of workers that are being identified. Now, the penalties for compliance. Well, as from the 1st of April 2006, the measures that are available to HMRC include, firstly, a notice of underpayment, which spells out the amount that you're not paying your workers, an award of arrears to the underpaid staff, and note that that is actually calculated at the current national minimum wage rate rather than the rate that would have applied at the time when the underpayment was made. On top of that, you face a financial penalty of 200% of the underpayment, which is subject to a minimum of £100 and a maximum penalty of £20,000 per underpaid worker. But listen on, because we'll be saying more about that. Yeah. Then there's the reputational risk of being named and shamed on a public record that anyone can have a look at on the internet. And finally, there's criminal prosecution. And the maximum penalty for underpayment of the minimum wage is an unlimited fine, with the most serious cases of non-compliance being tried in a Crown Court, which can impose an unlimited penalty and can also disqualify a director for up to 15 years. So we're looking at some serious fines there. Now, as with most legal things, ignorance is no defence. Accidental underpayment is not a defence, and in every single case where HMRC identifies arrears of the minimum wage at the start of investigation, it issues a notice of underpayment together with a penalty for the employer's failure, and that is regardless of the employer's explanation. So excuses are not going to help you, and many of the cases that have been named and shamed were not deliberate. Employers are not normally named while proceedings are underway. HMRC may refer to the employer to BEIS for naming or shaming, but it doesn't normally do that until the employer is successfully prosecuted. And although any employer can be named, irrespective of the amount that's owed, they don't normally refer cases for naming unless at least £2,000 is owed to workers, with an average per worker of at least £500. But as you'll see from the rest of this webinar, £500 is quite quick to add up, actually. And it can also refer cases to be named in a press release if basically it feels that the employer hasn't been playing ball with the rules. So if HMRC thinks that the employer has knowingly or deliberately failed to comply with its minimum wage obligations, or if HMRC had given it advice about what it needed to do to comply and it hadn't taken those steps, or the employer hasn't kept the right records, or has delayed or obstructed the compliance officer in terms of them trying to find out the details, or the employer hasn't answered the questions from a compliance officer, or who has refused to provide information or produce documents, or who has been ordered to pay arrears and hasn't done so, then HMRC may well say, no, that employer should be named in a press release. Now, if a worker has reasonable grounds to believe that they haven't been paid the minimum wage, then they have the right to see your records relating to them. And the way they do that is they should make a written request to you. And if you're required to produce the records within 14 days of receiving that request, or within an extended time period that you agree with the worker, if you can. Now, if you refuse to let the worker see the records, or you fail to produce them, then that person can bring a complaint in the employment tribunal. And if the tribunal upholds the complaint, they can award the worker 80 times the hourly rate of the minimum wage. Now, for somebody on the national living wage, that's £600. I did say I was going to be saying more about the maximum cap on penalties, which is £20,000 per underpaid worker. But the Best Connection group that I mentioned earlier was fined £263,000. So you say, well, how did they get to that amount? Shouldn't it have been 20,000? And that's what the Best Connection group thought. And it appealed against the penalty notices because HMRC had actually issued them with 13 penalty notices instead of one. And each penalty notice was in regard to a separate batch of employees. So the Nottingham Employment Tribunal looked at that and discovered that actually, if HMRC wanted to be particularly severe and take a different interpretation of the rules, it was perfectly entitled to do so. And not only is HMRC entitled to issue multiple penalty notices and therefore multiple penalty fines, but if it chose, it could actually get around the current cap by issuing separate notices for the same worker, but with each notice covering different time periods, provided that each of the penalty notices fell below the 20,000 cap. How do people go about enforcement? Well, employees, of course, may call ACAS for advice, and ACAS may then broker a settlement between the parties. But in terms of actually enforcing the minimum wage, that is HMRC's responsibility. And HMRC says that it has two main methods of identifying underpayments, and there's roughly an even split between the two. So the first main method is in response to complaints that are made by workers and third parties. And particularly, there was a new online complaint form that was introduced in January of this year, and that has resulted in lots more inquiries to HMRC. And the second main method of identifying underpayments is by focusing investigation activities on particular risk sectors, for example, retailing, hospitality, and hairdressing. And if HMRC is considering compliance, then the first thing that it looks at is the employment status of the person. So is this person entitled to the minimum wage anyway? Obviously, if they're an employee, they are, but otherwise we start to say, well, if they're a worker and therefore entitled to the minimum wage, HMRC then starts to look at the amounts that may have been underpaid. So first of all, it is worth noting the list of exemptions that are on my current slide. The genuinely self-employed people are not entitled to the minimum wage. Employees under school leaving age. I don't know if we've got any share fishermen here, or prisoners, or members of the armed forces, but the other common areas where you may well get people who are not entitled to the minimum wage are volunteers, yeah, and also directors. This can be a particularly tricky area, basically because company directors who are office holders only in common law can work and can be paid in that capacity. And provided that what they are doing is in their capacity as an office holder, they are exempt from the minimum wage. So in that case, it's okay for them to be unpaid, for example, in a startup situation. And it's also okay for them to be paid purely via dividends. Now, this is a tricky area, as I say, because HMRC sometimes takes a very different view and argues that the work that the person is doing is that of an employee, and therefore they should get at least the minimum wage. But the rules say that the minimum wage does not apply to company directors unless they also have contracts that make them workers. If there is an employment or a workers' contract with the company, then clearly they would need to be paid at least the minimum wage for the work that they've done under that contract. So HMRC says that grouping things together generally, there are four main areas where employers go wrong. And these are as follows. First of all, getting worker status wrong. Secondly, because of incorrect calculations and or because employers have made payments at old rates or incorrect rates, particularly apprentices in that respect. Thirdly, when employers fail to account for all of the time that's spent working. So they disregard unpaid overtime or time spent attending briefings or security searches or travelling time during the working day. And the fourth area is because they have made deductions from pay, which have taken that worker's pay to a level below the minimum wage. And that's an area where we have had a lot of inadvertent breaches because they've made deductions for pay for things like uniforms or discounted staff sales, that sort of thing. And our own experience on our helpline gives us lots of examples of areas of confusion, such as employers incorrectly counting allowances towards the minimum wage, such as tips, gratuities, free meals, cars, childcare vouchers, for example. And I'm going to be taking a look at mileage allowances and required dress codes as well fairly soon. Another thing about employment status is if the person is an employee, then it is clear they're entitled to the minimum wage. If not, are they then a worker? So our picture shows a cyclist because of the high level of media coverage of gig economy delivery people that we've been telling you about over the last few months. But of course, this does apply to all sorts of jobs in all sorts of sectors. So when you're looking at compliance with the minimum wage, the first thing to do is to check if you've got self-employed people, are they genuinely self-employed? Do they have the ability to send a substitute? being registered as self-employed for tax purposes doesn't necessarily make that individual self-employed for minimum wage purposes. And a lot of the gig economy cases have involved people who were previously described as self-employed, but when they've taken a case to the employment tribunal, they have been deemed, if not to be employees, then certainly to be workers and entitled to the minimum wage. Now, another area where you may go wrong in terms of employment status is, are they volunteers? Now, volunteers don't have to be working in the not-for-profit sector, and volunteers wouldn't qualify for the minimum wage unless they are really a worker, but they do need to be genuine volunteers, and you are really looking at fairly short-term arrangements there. There is also another category called voluntary workers. And these are people who work under a contract to personally perform work or provide services. So you think, yes, they're a worker, but they're working for either a charity or a voluntary organisation, an associated fundraising body, or a statutory body. And if they're working for one of those, then there is a specific exemption that applies to them, provided that they don't receive any monetary payment other than straight reimbursement of basic expenses that they have actually incurred and that they wouldn't have incurred if they hadn't been volunteering, or benefits in kind such as reasonable subsistence or accommodation. Now, normally expenses are limited to travel, refreshments and accommodation if they're working away from home, plus items needed for the work. But you do need to be very, very careful if you're relying on this exemption. If you're providing training for the specific work, that's fine. But if you're providing training that's not directly relevant to the voluntary work, or if you pay the volunteer a fixed regular amount for expenses that's actually more than they've spent, then they could be classed as a worker. And if so, they're subject to the minimum wage. And finally, we also have interns on this list, but we do need to check that they're not actually working and doing a job free with the promise of expected future employment. For interns, it's got to be clear that they're there just to learn and gain experience rather than you relying on them to complete work. And there's been quite a lot about interns in the press this week because a number of members of parliament are saying unpaid internships should not be allowed for a period of more than 4 weeks. After that, these people should be getting the minimum wage because they could well be doing work that's of use to you. That's not a law yet, by the way, they're just calling for this, but it is an indication of where things may well change in the future. So if we're looking in terms of checking employment status, in terms of action, look particularly at any non-employees who might regularly undertake work for you. In particular, look at ones that are calling themselves self-employed, and look at volunteers and look at interns to see, are they really workers? And the sorts of questions that you would be asking there is, well, do they have to turn up? Would you apply your disciplinary procedure to them if they fail to turn up on time? Do you provide work for the duration of the contract, and does that person have to perform the work personally? And don't just get it right now, but do keep an eye on all of these arrangements to check that they don't alter over time and become something that you actually weren't intending. So that's the first of the HMRC categories. The second one is incorrect calculations or rates. Now, incorrect calculations are often due to misunderstandings on the part of the employer as to what doesn't count towards the minimum wage. And checking minimum wage compliant is a different thing to checking what payments should count for tax and national insurance calculations. And what we mean by that is, for example, overtime payments, shift premiums, allowances such as London waiting or allowances for clothing or working unsociable hours, expense payments, tips and gratuities, all of those would be regarded as taxable earnings, but none of those count towards the minimum wage. The second thing is paying at the incorrect rate. Well, we mentioned earlier about people paying at the old rates, and many employers clearly are slow to react to changes in the minimum wage rates. These used to change every October, but now any changes take effect from the 1st of April. and they apply in the first pay period on or after that date. Missed birthdays are another thing. If the birthday and the new age would have taken somebody from a previous minimum wage band into a higher level band. And note that the rate payable there is the one that's in force on the first day of each pay reference period. So if you have somebody with a birthday that falls in the middle of August, like Sue, and they're paid monthly, then they only get the appropriate rate from the 1st of September onwards, unless you choose to be generous and backdate it to the middle of the month. But the rules say that the rate payable is that which is in force on the first day of each pay reference period. And apprentices are the other area here where often the incorrect rate is paid, and that is largely because of misunderstanding over the term apprentice, and secondly because of not noticing that people have gone over the age of 19 or the first year of their apprenticeship. Now, you can't just call somebody an apprentice who is actually a trainee. Yeah? They must be training under an approved apprenticeship framework for the minimum wage apprentice rate to apply to them. So if you have an in-house training scheme, that's not going to count, nor will just calling somebody an apprentice, even if you provide them with on-the-job coaching and development. It's section regulation 5 of the 2015 minimum wage regulations that spells this out, and basically the person has to have a contract of apprenticeship which specifies the training, the length of training and the qualification that they're going to gain, or they must be participating in an approved government scheme. Now, these have various different names, and in England, we're looking at the intermediate apprenticeships, advanced apprenticeships, higher apprenticeships, and trailblazer apprenticeships. So they've got to be a proper apprentice, yeah? And secondly, the apprentice rate only applies whilst the apprentice is either under the age of 19 or is age 19 or over, and they're in the first year of their apprenticeship. Once they're outside of that, they are entitled to the relevant rate for their age. And the other thing which actually came up this month on our helpline regards the working time. All time spent training or studying as part of the apprenticeship will count towards minimum wage calculations, as well as the time spent in the workplace. So typically, you might have somebody working 4 days a week for you, and on the 5th day of the week, they go to college. That 5th day, the time they spend at college, will count towards the minimum wage. So their pay has to cover the 5-day period. So in terms of action on this one, the first thing is obviously check that you're using the correct data for minimum wage compliance and that you're not counting payments which would not be counted towards the minimum wage. Note the date for the annual increases and prepare and budget for this so that you are aware of it. Have some sort of automated trigger system that accurately alerts you when someone's approaching a birthday that will move them from one minimum wage pay band into another one, and check their pay at that time. And keep an eye on your apprentices, not only with regards to their 19th birthdays, but also with regards to their anniversary of appointments, because if they're over 19 and they've completed the first year of apprenticeship, then the full minimum wage will apply to them from then on. Okay, our next area of non-compliance is unpaid working time. And the picture shows those working in the hospitality industry, because that is one of the risky sectors for minimum wage underpayments. But of course, underpayments may occur anywhere in any sector. And we're talking about, for example, unpaid overtime or time spent attending compulsory staff briefings or searches before you leave the premises, or travelling time during the working day. And these periods of time are often quite short, but they can be very regular, so they do add up over time. Now, the case that I talked about earlier with the Best Connection group, there were two main reasons for their underpayments. The first one was because if the workers turned up a minute late or more, then they had an automated clocking system, and the payment system that was linked to that would immediately default to the next quarter of an hour period, with the result that the worker wasn't paid for all of some of their, well, they weren't paid at all for some of their first 15 minutes at work. And then the second reason that prompted the underpayments was because they had security checks at the end of the day. And often the workers had to queue for around about 11 minutes after clocking off, during which time they again were not paid. They weren't actually working, but they were on the premises and at the employer's disposal, so that counted towards minimum wage compliance. Now, there are plenty of other examples of this sort of thing, and for example, time spent opening or closing a shop, requiring employees to attend training or briefings, requiring candidates who've been offered a job to train and work a trial period before they actually start in a position. And note that that is different to asking someone to demonstrate skills or giving them training as an integral part of the recruitment process before an offer of employment is made. You wouldn't have to pay for that, but if you've offered somebody a job and you are requiring them to train and to work a trial period, say shadowing, before they actually start doing the job, then you've got to pay them for that. So let's just take a couple of those examples in a bit more detail. For example, training and briefing. If you require your employees to turn up 15 minutes before they start work, then they should be paid the minimum wage for every hour they're required to work, and that would include that 15 minutes. Yeah, they might not physically be actually working at that time because they're getting ready for their working day on them. They could be being allocated tasks and you could be updating them on things. But if they are required to be there, they should be paid. If it's completely up to them whether they arrive 15 minutes early or not, and if you couldn't discipline them if they failed to turn up until their contract start time, then that 15-minute period is unlikely to be working time for which they should be paid. We have a lot of clients who are mobile and they make multiple client visits during the day and travel between them. Yeah. Now, for mobile workers like this, the initial travel time between their home and work and back again does not count towards the minimum wage, although it is working time for the purposes of the working time regulations. That's a different thing. But any other travel time that takes place during the working day would normally be covered. Now, it's fine to pay a higher rate per visit and not to pay for the travelling time at all, provided that the overall average hourly rate works out at more than the minimum wage. So their travel time counts, but contractual breaks wouldn't. But if the worker is at your disposal and you don't have any work for them to do between client visits, then that time would count as working time and it should be paid. And equally, with apprentices, if they spend time travelling from work to college and possibly back again during the working day, that travelling time would also count as working time. Sleeping time doesn't happen very often on our helpline, I have to say, but on-call sleeping time. Now, there's been a lot of media coverage about this recently, basically because it was an area of confusion where a number of people went wrong. But it is clarified now, and basically a person may still be working even if they're sleeping. And that depends on the type of work and the contractual or statutory arrangements that are in place, what they're required to do during that shift, and whether they are required to remain on the premises in order to fulfill a statutory obligation. And basically, if the person has to be there, then they should be paid the minimum wage for all hours spent on site. Now, this particularly affected care workers who were undertaking sleep-in shifts. And because there had been this confusion, the government made a concession and announced that it would waive any financial penalties that would have been levied against employers in the social care sector who underpaid their workers for overnight sleep-in shifts that were worked before the 26th of July 2017. That's a key date because that's when the ruling came out that confirmed that they should be paid the minimum wage, absolutely, definitely. Now, these penalties are levied by HMRC, but they don't affect any arrears of wages that must be paid to the workers who weren't paid the minimum wage. That still must be paid. And HMRC also suspended enforcement activity about the payment of sleep-in shifts in the care sector until the 2nd of October, but of course that date is now gone. So Any employer that's underpaying their workers for sleep-in shifts going forwards will have to pay the financial penalties, so 200% of the arrears. And note that this suspension of enforcement activity was only applied to cases in the social care sector where sleep-in shifts are a factor. So it's a very, very narrow group of people there. So action on unpaid working time. Firstly, check that your employees are recording all of their working time accurately and correctly so that you don't fall foul of that. Yeah, that includes your managers or salaried employees who are doing unpaid overtime. You do need to have records of that as well. And check any practices that may be risky, particularly the ones that I've mentioned above. The final category from HMRC was those who make the wrong sort of deductions from pay. Now, if you are making deductions for pay for things like tax and national insurance contributions, or repayment of a loan, or a deduction because you've given someone a previous advance of wages, yeah, or you've overpaid them. Let's say they've gone off sick and it was too late to amend the payroll, and so they were overpaid for the previous pay period, and you're now taking that money back. They would not take your employee below the minimum wage. Neither would deductions for student loans or union subscriptions or pension contributions, and nor, interestingly, would deductions for conduct that are allowed for by the contract of employment. But any other deductions from pay should not take the employee below the minimum wage rate. So let's have a look at those, because the types of areas where employers may go wrong include reimbursement for things like tools, uniform, safety clothing, which of course must be issued free of charge if it's essential, but if it's non-essential safety clothing and you're asking someone to pay for that, yeah, or the provision of meals or transport. Now, employers can still require the employee to meet the cost of those, yeah, but any deductions from pay must not take the employee below the minimum wage, and any required reimbursement mustn't reduce the worker's pay to less than the minimum wage. Accommodation is an area that there is still a lot of confusion about. Now, that's surprising actually, because the Queen found out very many years ago, to her cost, that you cannot offset the market rate against the minimum wage. So accommodation at Windsor Castle would only count at the set rate, which is now £6.40 a day. Yeah. So if you're an employer that provides accommodation for employees to live in, you can only use £6.40 a day, including weekends, to offset against the minimum wage. You can, of course, make a market rate deduction for the accommodation if the employee is a higher earner, but you can't make a deduction which brings the employee below the national minimum wage rate for all hours worked. Now, deductions for misconduct are another interesting area, because one of the areas where employers may go wrong if they deduct pay for lateness. And that's what we talked about earlier with the best connection group. So an employee who's only a few minutes late for work loses 15 minutes pay. Now, if they're a higher earner, then whether this is lawful will depend on their contract of employment. And if you have a clause in the contract, or if that deduction is required or permitted by statute, or if the worker has given their prior written consent to the deduction, then you can make that deduction from pay. Yeah? But you can only make it if there's a clear rule in your contract of employment, or a staff handbook, or a policy that's incorporated into the contracts. But even if the contract allows you to do that, you still can't reduce pay to the extent that it takes the employee's basic pay to below the level of the national minimum wage. And you need to be careful as well with those sorts of deductions, because you can end up facing a claim of indirect discrimination. So, for example, if your rules impact disproportionately on particular groups of workers, and the ones that I'm thinking of here are, for example, women with caring responsibilities, or pregnant workers who suffer morning sickness, disabled workers, or carers who have tricky school drop-offs. Well, if they are going to be disproportionately affected by this rule, then you could end up with an indirect discrimination claim. and there's also the risk of loss of goodwill, particularly if people have been putting in extra time afterwards at the end of the day without any compensation, and you make this big deduction from them. They're not going to do that from then on. So I was looking at the financial penalty and how the minimum wage is calculated, and I tried out the government's online calculator. And what I did was I used a 10-hour per week calculation with a worker paid at the minimum wage rate, because I was trying to work out whether it was a blunt tool or whether it actually went down to individual minutes, for example. But certainly if a worker was 0.01 of an hour late, then if they were paid less than the appropriate time for 9.99 hours, that was non-compliance with the minimum wage. And the same applies to penalties for substandard work. Now, these are uncommon, and we really don't come across these very often, but we have done from time to time. And one example was a hotel. And the cleaner in a hotel, they were fined £70 if a customer made a complaint about them, and the hotel ended up reimbursing the customer with the cost of the one-night stay. So the £70 was equivalent to the amount of money that the hotel had to pay out to reimburse the customer. But this fine would apply every time a customer complaint was made. So again, that would be unlawful if it took the workers' wages below the minimum wage. So if you're wanting to do a check on all of these, then first of all, check the areas where employers commonly go wrong. So we're looking at reimbursement for items such as tools, hairdresser scissors, for example, such as uniforms, safety clothing, the provision of meals or transport. You can still require the employee to meet the cost of these as long as the deductions from pay don't take them below the minimum wage, and as long as you're not taking more money from them, which would reduce the worker's pay to less than the minimum wage. Check accommodation if you offer it. If you do have financial penalties for lateness or misconduct, then do take a look at these in particular, especially if you have workers who are on or close to the minimum wage. Check any discount schemes, and what I'm meaning by that is, for example, clothing retailers that offer discount on clothing. Very often you can find that workers are buying lots of clothing because it's reduced and they like it, but if they are paying for voluntary purchases, then make sure that they actually reimburse you directly for those rather than you making a deduction from their pay, because you don't want that to take them below the minimum wage. And also check any dress code requirements if the employee has to provide a uniform themselves. And I'll say a bit more about that on the next slide as well. So I did a bit of a trawl around our helpline inquiries over the last few months because it's an excellent source of questions on this. And what was interesting was the range of questions that we actually got. So the following are examples of the sorts of queries that we've had from clients on these. Now, the first was mileage rates, and this relates to mobile workers who are paid close to the minimum wage rate and who are reimbursed a small amount, let's say 15p a mile, rather than being reimbursed with the 45p per mile approved mileage rate for travel in their own vehicle. Now, if you do that, this person could fall below the minimum wage rate, because HMRC says that if the worker's expenditure is in connection with the employment and it costs them more than 15p a mile for the business travel, then they could end up being paid less than the appropriate minimum wage rate for the hours that they've worked. So you do need to keep mileage reimbursement as a separately itemised line on the payslip, and you do need to take a look at this if that's what you do. If you're paying for travelling time, of course you should do this if it's during the working day, but using estimated travel times could be risky. So ensure that people are recording actual travelling times and that you're paying at least the minimum wage rate for the actual travel times. Sleep-ins at hostels or pubs obviously is a different situation from a sleep-in where you have a care worker who is required to stay on the premises to look after a vulnerable person that may wake up in the middle of the night and need treatment. Now, if you're talking about things like hostels and pubs, then HMRC looks at the individual circumstances and the arrangements. So looking at the contractual arrangements, asking whether there's a statutory obligation to have people on the premises, and also looking at what that person is required to do if they're called out during that time. If the person has a clear contractual or statutory, or there is a statutory requirement for that person to remain on the premises and they might be disciplined if they fail to do so, then it is likely that all of those hours will be classed as working time for minimum wage purposes. Now we have people who are on call at home, and basically if they're at home or elsewhere, but they're on call and all they're doing is responding to telephone calls when they're needed, maybe they need to go on site in a rare emergency situation, then provided that they're free to do other things during this time, they are only entitled to be paid for the hours that they're actually called on to work. When I say free to do other things, obviously there are some rules. You can have some rules about that. You know, they need to stay close to a phone. They mustn't drink in case they're needed to drive to site. That sort of thing would be acceptable. But it's perfectly fine to have somebody on call from 7 o'clock in the evening on a Friday all the way through to 9 o'clock on Monday. And if they only take 2 telephone calls, let's say on the Saturday of half an hour each, then only an hour would count towards their minimum wage payments. What you do need to be careful about is to ensure that they have the appropriate rest breaks between periods of call out, but there is no problem with them actually being on call for long periods. Now, we also have clients who pay a number of different hourly rates depending on what you're doing. So, for example, there could be a rate for client contact time, a rate for traveling, a rate for training. Yeah? And effectively, these workers must get at least the minimum wage on average for all hours worked in the pay reference period. But the basic rate of pay must still be at least the minimum wage, even where the employer's pay is always enhanced by premium supplements, because if you remember from what I said earlier, premium supplements and allowances don't count towards the minimum wage. So if you have somebody who only ever works nights, and therefore every single hour that they work, they receive the enhanced payment that applies to a night shift, then you still need to ensure that if you strip out that night shift allowance, that the basic rate is still the minimum wage. Yeah. So you take out any premiums before you actually check compliance there. And bonuses can fall into one of 2 camps. If they could be included in the minimum wage if they're related to performance, so a performance bonus, payment for that would count, but something like an attendance bonus is more likely to be regarded as an allowance, so would not be included. That's quite tricky, isn't it? Because it's easy to talk about different ends of the spectrum, but it's where you have things in the middle. Yeah. Other areas of risk, annual hours contracts. There have been instances of annual hours workers falling below the minimum wage rate within particular pay periods, and that would be where they work more hours than normal, but because their pay is averaged out, they receive the same pay for that month. Now, HMRC has actually said there is a regulation, it's number 213, and that requires annual hours to be specified in the contract, or for the contract to specify the number of weeks worked each year in a full calendar year. That would apply, for example, for schools. Yeah. Now, if there is a credible system like that for determining the annual hours, then HMRC will use that for minimum wage purposes. Salary sacrifice. Be aware that mustn't take the worker below the minimum wage. And what we're talking about here is not the payment that they get before the salary sacrifice, but the payment that they get after the salary sacrifice. And benefits in kind don't count towards the minimum wage. So if you have employees who've done salary sacrifice schemes for things like pension scheme contributions, childcare vouchers, cycle to work schemes, then you are not looking at the salary that they earn before the salary sacrifice, you're looking at the reduced pay when you're checking those figures. Uniforms, a bit trickier than you might expect actually, because if you require employees to follow a dress code without giving them that clothing or without giving them any additional pay to cover the cost of that dress code, then that can be considered something that brings their pay below the minimum wage. Now, the minimum wage guidance gives an example, and it uses a hairdressing salon which requires its employees to wear white t-shirts and black jeans. Now, that would seem to be quite ordinary apparel that you could wear outside of work. It's not necessarily got logos on. It's not a specific sort of form of clothing that you would never wear casually, like, for example, a physiotherapist's outfit. Yeah, but if that salon only pays the workers the minimum wage rate for the hours that they've worked and doesn't pay a clothing allowance, then HMRC will consider the employer has failed to pay the employee the appropriate wage. So even if your dress code is, for example, just all black, yeah, you do need to be careful. And the final thing that I came across on our helpline inquiries was banking time in lieu, because that needs to be carefully checked, particularly if you have weekly paid workers who are close to minimum wage rates. Because whilst employees may, of course, bank time to take off at a later date, if they're weekly paid workers, then a week is their relevant pay period, and they must be paid at least the minimum wage for all the hours that they work within that period. So any overtime for those workers may need to be paid rather than banked to take at a later date. What's going to change? Well, we don't quite have the crystal ball that's on the slide, but the LPC has made a number of recommendations about future change, and they are focused particularly in terms of raising awareness when the rates are increased each year, more publicity about the complaints process, continuing to name and shame employers who are non-compliant on a regular basis, and also publicising details about why people are making inadvertent underpayments so that others can learn from this. Looking at more publicity about the increase in enforcement activity, and then also they have suggested changing payroll software to include a tick box that the employer has to tick to confirm that the staff are being paid at the current level, yeah, which may result in them checking this more thoroughly. How that will apply to outsourced payrolls, I'm not sure, because very often they don't have the records of time worked. They just are told what to pay each worker. And another thing is information sharing. So, for example, given that apprentices are often underpaid, then HMRC should be looking at employers that are claiming the apprenticeship levy to actually target them to make sure they're paying the appropriate amount. And finally, there have been proposals to require greater information on payslips. The LPC has recommended that the payslip should include the hours that each worker is being paid for on their payslips, because that would help them to check their pay and it would help to increase transparency. So that is something that's been looked at as well. So I've covered all sorts of things to do so far, and hopefully you have picked up on the areas that you think might be risky within your environment, and clearly not all of them will apply to you. Other steps to take, well, first of all, look at areas which could be risky, where errors could arise, in particular where you have workers who are close to minimum wage rate or who are on the minimum wage rate. Check that you have detailed, accurate records of payments and time worked. You need to keep those for 3 years for the minimum wage purposes, but because a civil case for underpayment can be brought for up to 6 years, you might want to keep them for 6 years. Take a look at your contracts and check that they are detailed enough, especially annual hours contracts and apprentice contracts. If you have volunteers, keep records just in case you have to defend a claim. Ensure that your workers are trained to accurately record their time and to query any issues that they might have. And very importantly, if you find a mistake, put it right immediately by paying the arrears at the current minimum wage rate. Because HMRC has said that if an employer has confessed to an underpayment on a voluntary basis and has made the appropriate back payment in full prior to them getting involved at all, then they wouldn't subject that employer to a penalty or to naming and shaming. So, more help and guidance, where to go? Well, HMRC is running a series of free webinars, including ones on compliance with the minimum wage, and they also have a very detailed manual, and that's the link to the manual. ACAS passes complaints on to HMRC, but it will also settle claims via early conciliation. There is government guidance, which are links 2 and 3 there, as to what does and doesn't count as pay, how to calculate the minimum wage, how to enforce it. Gov.uk also offers guidance for employees, and the interactive tool, the link there is the one that I referred to earlier, which allows employees to input the number of hours they work, their age and everything else, and how many hours they've worked, and which actually tells you what they should have been paid and how much they've been underpaid. So that's quite a clever little tool there as well. We were hoping to have time for any questions, but I can see that I'm virtually out of time now, and also I've covered an awful lot of general areas. I suspect that anything else is more likely going to be involving you washing your dirty linen in public, and you probably don't want to do that. So if you have particular inquiries about this, please do email us and we will get back to you as soon as we can. It may not be today, but we will get back to you as soon as we can. And basically, that's it really. Thank you very much for attending. I can see that everybody has stayed with us throughout the entire period of the webinar, which is lovely. So thank you very much. I do hope you found it useful and informative. If you'd like copies of the slides and a recording of the webinar, they will also be available soon. And our final webinar of 2017, because we're not doing one at Christmas, is planned for Thursday, the 23rd of November. And we'll be taking a further look at GDPR, but concentrating on the HR aspects of that. So if that's of interest to you, do join us. We'll be sending out invitations by the usual emails at the beginning of next month. So thank you very much for joining us for this webinar. Have a good afternoon, and I do hope you found it useful. Thank you. Bye-bye.